Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all in the right session. We're going to talk about how to structure and analyze your survey data with Tableau. My name is Nazira Garrison. I am a product manager in the education services team. I look after some of our paid customer training offerings. So have any of you taken paid training classes, Tableau classes? Great, fantastic. So I look after some of those classes, making sure that you're all having a good experience. And before I came to Tableau, I was a physicist. Seriously, I was a physicist. And I came to Tableau, so I got all this data preparation and data analytics background. And when Christy said, let's do something about survey data, I was like, yes, let's. Because I've done a lot of work with survey data, and I've always found it really difficult to deal with. So hopefully, we can lessen your pain by showing you how we deal with this. So my co-presenter is Christy. She's a trainer in our education services department, and I'm going to let her introduce herself when she starts speaking. So what are we going to talk about? So we're going to talk about how to get the best out of your survey data in Tableau. To get the best out of your survey data, you've got to do a little bit of pre-preparation. So we'll talk a little bit about how to best structure a survey for best results. So how to ask your questions. We'll also talk about then the data preparation that you can do within Tableau to help make your analytics easier. And then I'm going to hand over to Christy, and Christy will talk about the different data types that you will get when you start working with Tableau, with survey data in Tableau, those different aggregations, what kinds of aggregations you might want to use, and then she'll go and show you some really cool chart types that will help you gain insight into your survey data so much faster. So before we start visualizing our data, we need to think a little bit about our data. Survey data is often very different. It's often a very different sort of beast of data than anything else that we normally work with. So let's have a look at some typical survey data. All right, this is what happens when I mute myself. So here we have some very typical survey data. Who deals with survey data like this, where you have one respondent per row, and then lots of answers across each row? Yep, you all deal with that. How easy is it to deal with that data in Tableau? I'm getting all this none. What do you guys do? You pivot? What else? Ultrix. Crying is not an option, okay? Crying about this is not an option. So we all deal with this type of data in Tableau. The question is, what can we do with it to make analytics faster and easier? So this data set is actually taken from NPAS, and it is a bunch of data where respondents were encouraged to identify just how nerdy they are. The subject of this conference has been Show Your Data Nerd. So this was asking people to self-identify how nerdy they are. So we have this row ID, and then we have all these different questions. What's the first thing you notice about all these different questions? Numeric responses. Yes, that is a really good thing to remember when you start doing survey data and you want to bring it in Tableau. Tableau works really, really well with numbers. So if you have numeric data, it'll be easier for Tableau to work in that. You might have to do a little bit of data prep afterwards, but it will be easier for you to work with that in Tableau. What else do you notice? Do we know what any of these questions are? No, we have no idea what these questions are. To figure out what these questions are, we have what is known as a helper file. And this helper file sort of gives us a key. it shows us what each of these questions are and what each of these descriptions are. You'll have noticed that I put them into a separate file, simply because it's just much easier, it's a best practice to keep your files as clean as possible. Make sense? So now you don't have all these words stringing across and overlapping cells. So it just looks cleaner. Because this isn't supposed to be human readable. You're going to bring it into Tableau and then let Tableau be the interface between your brain and the data. So let's bring this data into Tableau. And here's one I prepared earlier. This is the data in Tableau. It's exactly the same NPAS data, and I've just brought it into Tableau. Now, this data is written in sort of what I term human readable format, 1 row per respondent. We call this data wide, because if you have a lot of questions, your data set can get really, really wide, and there's an awful lot of scrolling to go on. If we were to go ahead and bring this and go to our worksheet right now, following these visual prompts, we get a whole bunch of stuff in there that we don't know how to deal with. This is clearly a dimension. Our row ID is clearly a dimension. But we notice here that we have things like age, education, gender, handedness, whether one is married or not. What do these sound like to you? Do these sound like measures to you? No. These are all dimensions. These are all ways that we might want to slice and dice our data. And we could go ahead and drag everything up to the measures pane, to the dimensions part of the data pane. We could do that, but it's going to get very tedious. Yes? So let's not do that, because I don't want Tableau to be tedious for you. That would be bad. So when we bring our wide data into Tableau, Tableau kind of goes, I really don't know how to deal with this. Tableau has a little bit of a Napoleon complex when it comes to its data. It likes its data to be tall and not wide. It doesn't like short data, it likes tall data. So one of the first things you can do with this is you can pivot it. And we're going to go ahead and do that in a moment. But first, I want to think about these questions again. So let's go back to that helper file. And when we go back to that helper file, we notice that questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all of the rest of them, what do they all look like? Sorry? Yes, they're yes, no. Yes, they're Likert scale data. You're being asked to rate yourself on a scale. So they're all similar sort of things about personality traits, things that might define you. If we scroll down a little bit, and we look at these questions labeled TI, PI 1 through 10, what do these seem like? Personality traits. So these are personality traits that you might assign to yourself. They're slightly different data, it's a slightly different bit of data to the first set, yes? And then we have all these words, vocabulary 1 through 16. You might notice that some of these words are made up. And in this personality test that was done, this nerd definition test, these are actually, people were told, do you know the definition of these words? So it's seeing whether you were willing to admit whether or not you knew something. Might be a measure of how arrogant you are, I don't know. So there are ways we can deal with this in Tableau or before we get our data into Tableau. If we go ahead and look at our original sheet, you'll notice that I have split things out. I have several different tabs here at the bottom. I have the personality Likert, these personality words, vocabulary, demographic data. That is basically all of this data, all split out into these different categories based on the question. This is great if you have a static survey that you have finished with. If you have a static survey that you have finished with, this is fantastic. But most of you probably don't, right? Most of you are going to get new data coming in. So how do we deal with that? Well, the way that we deal with that is by creating data extracts in Tableau. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to show you how to do some data shaping in Tableau so that you can get the data in the right format for what you need to do. So we are going to hide everything apart from our first 26 questions. And now, questions 26 through 1, we're going to multi-select, and we're going to pivot that. You'll notice that I haven't included row ID in my pivot, because that's how I want to identify my rows. If I include that in my pivot, everything's just going to get really messy, and I'll have no way to join between different tables. So let's go ahead and pivot that, and let's rename this. As a side note, I'm going to look at my helper file very quickly and notice that the fields labeled Q1 through whatever say question. So I'm going to rename this field here question. And I'm going to rename this field response. Now, when I drag everything into Tableau, I basically have a list of my questions. Everyone good with that so far? Now I'm going to do a little trick that Christy taught me on how to deal with these aliases. So we have our helper file, right? I'm going to go ahead and create a connection to our helper file. And when I do that, I drag in the helper file sheet. I have my question and my description. And now, because I renamed my question field exactly the same, when you will automatically notice that on my helper file data source, there is that little link there that tells me my helper file has an automatic blend connection. Yes? So now, when I bring description out here, it blends the data automatically. I'm going to click on the drop-down here and say Edit Primary Aliases. And when I do that, watch what happens. I'm going to hit OK. And now, my question 1 from my primary data source, my questions from my primary data source, if I bring them in, have that description. Quick, easy, simple. So now maybe we want to look at those personality words. First of all, I'm going to create an extract of this. I'm going to hide all my unused fields and create an extract. And we'll go ahead and save that extract. And we'll rename this data source. What do we want to rename this data source to, Christy? Is it nerd traits? That works? Yes. So we'll rename this to nerd traits. Now you're probably wondering about the rest of that, the rest of that data. Well, I'm going to create a new data connection. And when I create that new, oops, wrong one. When I create that new data connection, I'm going to create a new data connection to that NPAS personality data set. Create that new connection and drag out my NPAS data again. Hide everything that I don't need. So everything up to Tippy 1 I don't need. Hide everything after Tippy 10. Oops. So let's hide all of that. And then pivot this data. And I'm going to go through exactly the same procedure again. Call this question, call this response. And now when I go back to my sheet, you'll notice that I have another connection to the same data file. But if I was to bring out this data, whoops, let's go to a new sheet. If I was to bring out this data, you will notice that it is all the tippy data. So I can do exactly the same thing again. I can bring out the descriptions from my helper file, and I can edit the primary aliases. And there we go. And I can rename, calling this personality words. And create that extract. So now I'm creating different data extracts for each of my different question sets. The reason I'm doing that is that if I have a main data source that is coming in as one long report with all of my responses, creating these extracts means that as my data source refreshes, my extracts will automatically refresh depending on how it's been set. And I won't have to do this tedious copy-pasting all the time. So this automates that problem of creating different tables. Sound good? The only thing I'm not going to do is when I deal with my demographic data, I won't pivot that. And I won't pivot that because we want all of those different dimensions. That makes sense? All right. So that's basically how you start shaping and dicing your survey data to get it into Tableau so that you can start doing things like cross-database joins, blends, and really getting into the analytics. So I'm going to hand over to Christy now, who is going to talk to you about what you do once you have your data into Tableau.
Thank you, Naz. All right, so quick introduction about me. As Naz says, I'm Christy. I'm a trainer in Tableau. I teach the desktop classes as well as visual analytics. So my focus is much more on telling the story with the data and how to get it to effectively convey the information that you're after. So that's where I really focus. And I have to say, I talked to several of you before we started up here. And there's 2 classes offered this week on survey data. How many of you attended Steve Wexler's? Okay, decent number of you. There's a lot more to survey data than you can cover in 2 hours. I'm guessing you guys are aware of that between those 2 sessions. So we tried to push into this as much as we could. As far as the data prep side, the big takeaway from that, especially for those of you using Alteryx or other tools, is isolating that information out so that we can have that tall data around one question type or one setup. Steve Wexler and Emma White, who is with Information Lab, both have fantastic blogs that dive into a lot more detail on that. But when you get the data shaped in that way, where it's tall rather than wide, that's when we can start doing some of these different visualizations that are going to convey the information a little more easily. So part of the issue with survey data, and let me find out from you all, how many of you do scaled data? 1 through 5, 1 through 7? Okay, how many of you feel really great about how it's being portrayed right now? Like, yep, we got it down. Awesome. How many of you are doing more categorical or nominal data, where I've got pick many things from this list, okay? I've picked 3 of them. How do we tell who've picked several of those versus 1 versus 2, what goes together? Okay, so those are some of the issues we're going to look at, and we're going to start off first with just a very quick thing on the different data types and what we can do with them. I'm going to go through this section rather quickly as we move into the chart types. Again, this is kind of an overview. So you've got access to the Twibix files with the different visualizations to reverse engineer them. We're not going to go into as much on how to build them, but which ones work with which types of questions and some of the basic calculation information you'll need behind those. Last show of hands for at least the next 20 seconds. Level of detail calculations. Who feels really comfortable with those? Okay, got a few of you there. I lied, second to last. How about your table calcs? How many of you feel really good with the table calcs? Okay, I have found those have come into play more with survey data than with other data. So the nominal data, just as a quick look, that categorical data where we're saying it's descriptive. So why, what, when. It might be that single select list or that multi-select list, or often it's the text responses. Okay, so we've got information that's not quantifiable, it's not on a numeric scale, and how we break that down. We also have our ordinal data. So I've told someone to rank something on a scale, or rank these 10 items 1 through 5. So how do we deal with data that's come back from multiple people with these different rankings? We're not going to dive into this one as much because we didn't see that in as many of the different survey data responses that we got back from people in these classes. But sometimes the analyst has to rank those responses on popularity. Our interval data, so our different scaled data, asking people, how do you feel? Much like our ordinal data, it's all in order. So I have my I totally disagree to I think this is fantastic and amazing. And we have different steps in between. So the data's in order, but we have an equal distance between those members. Okay? Temperature is another example. So I can tell how far apart they are. Our ordered data, we don't know how far 1 is from 2. We just know that they go in that order. So it changes the math that you can do as you have these differences. And then the final type of data, which we're really not going into here at all, is that ratio data. So it is just like my ordered data in that I have a lower and an upper, and it's the same distance between them. So $1 to $2 to $3, same thing. Difference is that 0 means there isn't any. If I put something like a 0 on a scale, that doesn't mean I lack in emotions. That just means either I didn't respond or I'm on the bottom end of that scale. Okay, so the ratio data is where we can do our big math. The reason this matters is it changes what it's okay to compute with those different fields. So we're really limited on what we can calculate with our categorical or nominal data because pretty much we can count them. See how frequently did this one occur. So that changes what we can do in Tableau, and it means we're doing a lot of count distinct. Or simple counting of the information. With that pivoting of the data, that count distinct becomes increasingly important. With our ordinal data, so our data that's in order, again, we can do everything with nominal, but we can also find the median. What's the midpoint? What do we have people 50% below, 50% above? So we can find a little bit more information. With interval, we can start doing a bit more advanced math, and we can also get in and start doing that mean, that standard deviation, that average. There's controversy on scaled data as to whether it's ordered or interval. Not dealing with that in here. We're treating it as interval data, but for the calculations we're using, you can switch the type if you have preferences on that. Okay? So these are the types of calculations that we can do. One quick tip is if you are trying to add some context into your visualization, so we can get the number that we need, but we want to have what's the world that exists in. If you go and do a calculation one level up, so for example, if we find our median, then frequency may matter. Find the median, grab that mode. That if you go up, that provides some contextual information, either as reference lines or backgrounds, that helps that answer pop a little bit more. So that was it on just those different data types, but it breaks out fairly neatly into some of the different kinds of questions we can have. So from here, we're going to go ahead and start diving into some of the different chart types that you can use, and we're going to work from the top down. So we're going to start with that categorical information, and then we'll move on down into our scaled data as well. So with that being said, as Naz told you, wow, I just got really loud. Don't talk while looking down. As Naz told you, we are going to be looking at nerd data. And part of the appeal for me on this data was my background's also psychology. So I worked for a brief period of time as a licensed professional counselor. Didn't want to bring any too depressing data, but I found this public data set on your nerdiness. And what it's having you do is rank yourself. How nerdy am I? And from there, it grabs your scores. By the way, there's a link if you want to go take the survey and see how you measure out. It grabs your scores and checks to see how you fit on these different things that people traditionally consider nerdy or not. So let me get into my Twibix file. There we go. And we're going to go ahead and start demoing that data. And as I said, we're going to start with that categorical information. So there's things that we might slice or dice or just want to count. Fairly easy, straightforward stuff to do, but I do want to talk a little bit about how filters and other pieces come into play with this. So for our categorical data, these are a single select. And you'll notice I have a self-rating or nerdiness scale up there already. While it looks like that 1 through 7, that scaled data, this is actually what we're using to evaluate everything within this survey. So even though it's scaled, I'm treating someone ranking themselves as a 5 as something that I want to use to split my data. So those who rank themselves below or above. So since I'm using it to divide that data out, I'm treating it like a dimension. Okay? So instead of doing any aggregations on this, I'm going to use that to divide and parse my information. We've also got, of course, the basic demographic data, gender, marital status, education level. I won't read this to you. I'm sure you've read it in the time that I've been talking. But the one that's really fun for me on this were those vocabulary words that Naz referred to. We've got this multi-select where I have different fake words. And for those of you that thought you knew all of them, the ones in orange are the ones that don't have any real definitions, okay? So again, this is interesting to find out if people who self-style themselves as a nerd, are they more or less likely to say that they know the definitions of those words? So I wanted to break the information out by seeing if someone was very low or very high, how would they make that choice? Would they say, yes, I know all of them? Or if someone's self-styled a little less nerdy, are they going to be the ones guessing? Okay? So we're starting with that, and the idea that I'm using that scale as the primary comparison. 7 was too many for me. There's a lot of different methodologies or decisions you can make on how you split these out. I went with just the idea that if we have that 7 or 6, it's very high, somewhat is the 5 or 4, and not at all is going to be that 3, 2, 1. So I've divided it out into 3 groups just by creating a group in Tableau over here. So that's going to allow me to use this to split and divide that data. Now you'll notice I'm doing a sum on number of records, and that's the one thing that I do want to be cautious of, is when we pivot this data, we're duplicating the number of records on down. So in that case, you'll want to go with count distinct of your primary key. So in this case, that'd be row ID. Since this data wasn't duplicated down, I can use that sum number of records and tell how many people filled out each one. So raise your hand if you're very. Small number in this group. Raise your hand if you're somewhat. And your other hand if not at all. Okay, so mostly in here we're somewhat. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and continue on through with this data. And again, because this categorical information is fairly limited in what we can do as far as the counts, the different calculations we can make, I'm using it in a couple of ways. Number one, we've got the group over here listing out all of the different types of nerdiness or levels of nerdiness, and then the gender breakdown within that. So we're using discrete fields to display just the number with the gender breakdown as a percentage. And all we're doing with these are very basic table calculations of just that percent of total. For the record, this is not a dashboard I would ever publish. Just wanted to have all of these up there and shown. I'm not getting a lot of information from it. But we can see with some of those different education choices and gender, I can use 1 to break everything else back down by this further. So I've narrowed everything down now just to women. So using dashboard actions and other tools, I can use the individual views to do what we call guided analytics. And this lets you start to walk through that story so people can pick and choose what piece they want to break it down by. So right now this is just dividing, but I also have the ability, again, just to do the basic bar charts where we're doing that percent of total, that table calculation to get my percent all the way down on the differences between those status. I think these are fairly simple to work with, so I didn't want to spend too much time on these specific examples. But are there any questions or issues that you're running across in displaying your categorical data that you want to bring up before we move forward? Excellent. So that brings me to what I think is a little more fun with this and brings some more calculations in, which is where I want to identify who has made specific selections. So I want to be able to tell what percent of people by each different ranking of how nerdy they are was willing to fake those words. Does anyone have something similar like that in their data, where they're trying to parse out, okay, I've got a couple in the back. People made some choices but not others, and I want to see if those choices were similar across different groups. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit deeper into this one, and for that, let me switch on over to my first visualization, which is very, very colorful. Okay, so in this case, a couple of different things have happened. Number one, I've done that same group, so I've got the fake words and the real words, where I've just built a group that allows me to divide those out, so I can see which is which. We've also done a percent of total. So in this particular case, I want to see overall what percent of everyone who answered these exams went ahead and gave it a yes, said, I agree, I know what that word means. And you'll notice that the word verdid was known by 20% of the population, which is not bad. Flirted apparently was not as frequently recognized. I don't know what makes the difference there. But when we do these calculations, when we put the discrete field here, I'm getting my overall information. The issue is that I'm going to want to be able to filter this down and break it down by individual genders. So these numbers show the difference from my overall. My overall is done using a fixed table calculation. And the reason we do that as a fixed table calculation is when I apply a filter, my fixed calculation ignores it. So that means that this number will be 19.9 even if I narrow my data down to look at just one gender or just one level of education. So because of that, I can calculate out this percentage even if I narrow it down further by an individual gender. Does that make sense? Okay, so those fixed calculations allow me to set that overall population, and then as I do the math within it on my other fields, so in this case we have that difference from average, I'm able to see that my overall, that likely to say yes, that was built with that with that fixed calculation, is going to stay static, whereas my percent responses, this is going to change as the aggregation and the filters in my view change. So that's one piece of it. The second piece I want to look at is the shading in the background. So you may notice that my negatives are bright orange when the words are real, and they are bright blue when the words are fake. Basically, it's good or bad in different directions. It's bad if we don't know the word when it's real. It's good if we don't know the word when it's fake. So just pointing out that even though good and bad are reversed in these examples, as far as what one means as being good, lying is bad, knowing is good, we can build out if-then statements that allow us to bucket and group that information as well. So with just a simple calculation, we can tell Tableau that if the word has been grouped as real, and I just want to point out this is new in Tableau 10, that groups can be used in our calculations. I think that's going to be a big impact on survey data, whereas before you could not use those groups. Once you're on Tableau 10, you can pull them into the calculations. So this lets me take that group information and then allow that switch on that coloration, depending on whether lying is a good thing or not. Okay? So I can switch that color scale based on the group. So that's the first part of it, and then in my particular case, narrowed it down to just those fake words so that I can have that smaller scale. I don't need to see those real words as well, and then I can see as I change this from one gender to the next or narrow that data down, those percentages will be based on that overall total. So even if I go through and alter my filter, that my percentages are going to change and update, but it's always compared to that static overall population. Okay? So fixed level of details have become a really big deal for me in Tableau. So that's a fairly basic look at a multi-select, but it can get a lot more complicated than that. Multi-select, how many of you have multi-select where people can pick several things and you want to know who picked 2, who picked 3, what 3 did they pick? This is another big one that can be a bit of a challenge. I'm going to take this down to a level of knowing 2. So we want to be able to just see dynamically what 2 have been chosen, but we can go past that. We can go to 3 or 4 or 5. Again, I'm basing this on the idea that we've made tall data. There's other solutions and other approaches if we've prepped our data in a wide way to this specific issue, but because so many of us use Alteryx or the Excel plugin, or since I like doing everything in one tool, I prefer doing it with the extracts because now I have each of them separate and can play with them on their own. But in this particular case, what I want to do is I want to be able to understand which different, and in our data it's actually planet of origin, which different planet of origin the various people specified as them coming from. So I'm going to switch over to that first. At its most basic, the first question we have is how many picked more than one choice? Okay? That's actually fairly easy to find in Tableau because when we rotate that data, when we make it long rather than wide, I can now see that anyone who made 2 selections on that multi-select now has 2 rows of data. So we can just count how many rows they have. We do that using a level of detail calculation that allows us to lock by each individual. Ooh, let me get that open. There we go. So for each individual row, count how many different planet of origins we have selected. So by building that fixed calculation, we're able to go in and at least narrow it down to that level, okay? And because we used a fixed level of detail calculation, we're able to take that and use it as a dimension. In Tableau, all of our aggregations, all of our measures change as our view changes. If I drag new fields in, new fields out, it's going to change my level of detail. However, we can build a fixed calculation which says, I don't care what my view is doing, just count them by that row, count them by that unique identifier. And in doing that, we can get that unique count, turn it into a dimension by just dragging it up to dimensions, and then go back and do a distinct count on that row ID. So we now know how many. So that's the first view. We've broken it down. We can identify how many people made more than one answer, but I want to go beyond that, and I want to know what answers they made. So in this case, I'm taking that same view with the bars, and it's listed across the top, where we can see that 85% of our respondents chose one planet of origin, 12.6 chose two. Easy enough. And below that, we see the breakdown of their responses. So I can tell that 76.7% chose Lunarian and 15.1% chose Venetian. I do not know if I am saying those correctly or not. Again, level of detail calculations. If I filter this data, so I use that level of detail calculation to narrow it down, notice that my bar changed. So now we're changing and seeing of those who picked two different choices, these are the percentage breakdown within that. So of people who chose two planets of origin, 88% chose Lunarian. Now this calculation, you may want to show a number of different ways. We might want to base that on the number of filtered respondents. So out of everyone who chose two, 88% said at least one of them was Lunarian. Okay? That's a table calculation because as my view changes, that percent of total changes with it. If I switch this and I just have a parameter to swap my measures to percent of all respondents, now we're saying of all of the respondents, 11.2% made two choices, then one of them was Lunarian. So I can say, is this percentage off of everyone or just the group? And that fixed level of detail calculation ignores the filter. So it lets me calculate it a little bit differently. Lets me have that set static number. Okay? So that's a start, but I want to go a little bit further, and I want to know what was chosen in combination with this. So I want to be able to select one of these bars, and another show me the breakdown of what other choices were made along with it. I want to be able to calculate that out and find out what those secondary choices are. To do this, we need to self-join the data. In other words, let's step back just a moment, and I'm going to build a new worksheet. Okay, so let's start over here, and it's going to push me to the end. But if I take a look at this data, if I want to start counting this information, and let's bring out our row ID, and let's bring out that question, which is planet of origin in this case. If I decide, okay, I have someone who is self-styled as an Earthling, the moment I decide to narrow that data down or focus in that one individual spot, I've now eliminated all of the other choices that they've made. The problem is that everything exists in one column. So that becomes a little limiting here where it's expanded our horizons in some of the other spaces. So rather than having it narrow down and limit it in that way, what I want to do is I want to join the data back to itself. So I have another column with that same information. So if I narrow down my Earthling data, my second column that just repeats that information shows everything else selected along with it. This is one of the reasons I like doing this as extracts, particularly with the new cross-database joins. If I need to do this across multiple different questions, I can use the cross-database join to bring it together from different extracts. If I have just one table, then I can go in, and let me go ahead and go back to this data source. Okay, so in this case, this is that cross-database join, where I'm connecting the two to each other. If I want to focus on this having come in from an individual piece of data, so hold on, just going to keep using words till I can get my hand to catch up with my mouth. One moment. So in this particular case, I'm using that cross-database join, but I have another data set where I haven't done that process yet. So let me go ahead and grab that data. And in this particular data, we've got the row, we've got the question. So since I want to relate it back to itself, I can just grab that extract and drag it on in. So I'm repeating the same table, drawing the same table back in. And in this case, I'm going to do a left join, or in this case, inner or left shouldn't make a difference. And I'm going to grab question, and I'm going to relate that back to my pivot field name. So that's the field that was switched on over. And so as a result of that, as we go down, anyone who answered the question with the same response, and these are obviously aliases, so it's joining on that data underneath, but when people answered with the same response, they're going to get duplicated, because if I have 5 records, then each record here is going to join to those same 5 in that second row. So we get more rows for each individual. So as a result of that, when I go in, I'm able to, one moment please, I end up having 2 separate fields that I can use where I have my question information on rows, so I'm narrowing that information down here, but I push that over to the joined. So I have 2 separate dimensions with the same data. If I narrow it down to Earthling on one side, then anyone who chose Earthling is going to have all of their other responses listed in that joined field. So that lets me narrow it down, but still keep those multiple responses. So now I can see both. For those of you that need this technique, market basket analysis and Tableau, those are your keywords. There's wonderful step-by-step instructions. It works beautifully for multi-select survey data, and it allows you to do additional views where you can come through, and let's see if I can find, there we go. You can do things like this as well, where you can see both across. I have my original question field down the columns, my row field, my question down the row, the join field on columns, so I can see both and see where that intersection happens. So this works really well for 2, and I can now see where those line up, okay? If you want to go beyond that and do things like identify specific groups of 3, happy to talk about this afterwards. There's a number of ways to approach it. It just seems to be a little more specialized to certain groups, so I didn't want to go into that as heavily here, okay? But similar steps, also using those level of detail calculations in conjunction with it. So that's the multi-select. Any questions on that before we move forward into our interval data? You guys are not a questioning group. All right. Okay, so from here, yes? Okay. Okay, now we can come back to that, and we'll be around afterwards also if you wanted to take something offline. So that gets us to a decent spot, but interval data is the next piece. And again, how many of you have some sort of interval data that you're trying to figure out how to visualize? Okay. Steve Wexler does a fantastic job, and I will admit both of these were taken directly from his website. I think he does a fantastic job, or both of these concepts were taken directly from his website. He does a fantastic job of coming up with some of these visualizations. Again, in this case, we're trying to understand how someone who self-identifies as nerdy, how do they feel about themselves on these different traits? Where would they rank on these different traits? So we're going to use both of those together. The self-assignment, what am I, as well as how do I consider each of these different items, each of these scaled items? Where do I see myself on those? So we'll start with what's known as the divergent bar chart, okay? How many of you have seen these before, divergent bar charts? Okay, I love these. I think they're a lot of fun to play with. But with these divergent bar charts, at their heart, they're nothing more than this, okay? It's a percent of total. So this is just a basic percent of total chart. This can be done with no special knowledge, no special calculations in Tableau. All we're doing is saying, I want to get every question listed. So we list our questions down on our rows, and then these bars in the background, you'll notice it's a dual axis chart, so I am doing a dual axis. But in the background, we have a count of that row ID. Remember, we're flipping that data, so we may have duplication, uneven duplication of rows. So when we do that count on that row ID, the big thing here is that this response is not something I'm going to do math on. What I'm doing with this response initially is dividing my data out. So I use that response as a dimension. Instead of leaving it here in my measures, I can drag it up to the dimension area, and that's going to allow me to separate that bar out by each of the different responses. In doing that, I can then calculate out how many people are underneath each of these. So again, it's just that basic bar chart. I can calculate that information out and get my percent of total behind it. So I'm counting my individual rows, dividing those groups up by what different response was made. And that gives me the width of these bar charts. If I want to add any label onto that, I can do a percent of total. So let me just drag that on over. We've got just that percent of total, and for the percent of total that you do on these bar charts, you're computing them for the individual cell. 1 bar, 1 mark is 1 cell. So it's just a basic bar chart setup with that response dividing it up. Then we have, whoops, wrong thing got moved off. Let me undo that. Then we have the circle on top. That's just a dual axis. So in this particular case, I just wanted to know, we've got the display of the information, which responses were more popular, but I also wanted to average that information and have that display on top. So we can do a dual axis chart, and the dual axis chart allows me to have a second mark, and in this case chose a circle with a text label on it. So we can have that information over here displayed separately, and we can take and switch this to a dual axis so it lays on top, and adjust our scales so that the sides fit cleanly. Okay? So that gets us the percent of total, and the reason I spend a little time on that is because transferring it to a divergent bar is the exact same principle. You'll have access to the Twibix if you want to download this, but these calculations on the left are what get us there. The divergent bar, the big difference in the visualization here is instead of having everything locked side to side, we shift those bars so we can see more cleanly what's on the high end, what's on the low end. And we do that by setting a center point, which is the middle of our scale, and anything that's below that counts as negative, so it's going to pull it to the left. Okay? So that allows us to shift that bar backwards and slide it down, so that 2.4 stands out a lot more strongly, that we had so many people in the lower end of that response. So that allows us to see that distribution a little more cleanly. This relies completely and totally on using the Gantt bar. I'm from Texas. I say Gantt and I feel too Texas. Gantt, there we go. So it relies on using that bar. And what we're doing with this is we're first telling it how far back to go. And that's what these 6 calculations do, is this Gantt start tells us how far back on our axis do we need to go. We do that by calculating out how many responses we have, how many of them are negative, and then determining how far back we go. From there, we can use our percentage to set the size of each of these. Steve Wexler has an awesome tutorial on his website, datarevelations.com, that walks through how to do this. You can also download the Twibix here, and like a lot of calculations in Tableau, you can take this whole cloth. All you would have to do is change the variable name. So you can plug in what is your dimension, what's your unique identifier, plug in what are your responses, and just plug and play, copy the calculations directly in, and you can build this. Okay? So that's the divergent bar. You can display the same information in what's known as a dumbbell chart. So with the dumbbell chart, it's similar, but a little bit different. Whoops, looks like I played with this a little too much too recently. I'm getting the errors on those on one of them. Okay. So with the dumbbell chart, the difference is instead of seeing that full spread and seeing the percent response in each of them, I wanted to divide this out into 2 categories. One is those people who considered themselves less nerdy than I consider myself, and those who consider themselves more. So we go back to having that dimension of that nerd scale being the dividing factor. So we can use a parameter to say, all right, I'm going to pick something. And in my case, this particular parameter is setting a reference line. So it's showing what that middle point is. It's calculating that average based on that, how that classification works. And then we're building a chart with the circles on either side. Again, that dual axis chart. These are awesome for getting some of these more interesting visualizations pulled together. So I could aggregate and find out what is the average score for those people who rated themselves lower than me on the scale, and what is the average scale for those who rated themselves higher. So I could have done this without using the parameter and just seen the spread on high versus low, but I wanted to be able to build a visualization that would let people put themselves into it. And so how would I stack up against the typical aggregation? So with that parameter, you can make that calculation happen, and you can do that slide. So as you make the different changes, you're going to see the bars adjust and see that reference line. Are you closer to the upper end or the bottom end? So all of those change, all of those calculations change as I change the selection on my parameter. Okay? Any questions on this one? All right. Got just a couple more things that we want to take a look at. The final piece, before we move into dashboards very briefly, has to do with comparing measures. So we may end up, and I chatted with someone who talked about doing some quadrant reporting earlier, but we may end up with wanting to compare things from different groups. So I might want to be able to compare someone's nerdiness scale from one data set to a personality trait they selected elsewhere. And again, I want to break it down by those 7 pieces. So our scatter plot can be a fantastic way to set up these different visualizations to do that comparison, where you can go through, and in this particular case, notice again 2 extracts, and this time done with a blend, because I'm not worried about going down to that row level data. I don't need to find out what the answers were on every individual row. I want to get my aggregate. Someone who ranked themselves as a 7, what was their average openness to new experiences, and how does that compare to how they rank themselves on whether or not they enjoyed learning more than they need to? So if I want to do those comparisons across these 2 questions, since I have row ID in both of those extracts, I can simply blend on that field. Okay? And by blending on that field, I'm going to be able to get a direct comparison, even though that data is stored in 2 separate places. Okay? So with that, and adding in that concept of parameters, I'm able to switch through and pick different personality traits. And with nerdy on my dimensions, that allows me to make as many different selections as I like and see, are these shifting together? Are there any outliers? Are there any differences? So a parameter for each of the different things that you want on each axis can be hundreds of values if you like. You can do the same thing with a dimension on how it's split out. So you can use Tableau to visually make those shifts and see, are there spots where we end up with an outlier? Are there places where that pattern change? So these can be a very effective way to compare measures, either within one data set or if you've got them on different questions at that level as well. Okay? Final thing I do want to take a little quick look at is dashboarding. So we've just got a few minutes left, and then we'll open it up for questions or let you move on to your next activity. But with dashboarding and with displays, the same rules apply. Dashboardings are one of my favorite things to look at and talk about, actually, but you want to consider your goal first. Is it to inform? Is it to persuade? Is it to explore? So a lot of these things using parameters and making it possible for people to switch things in and out, if you want someone to be able to explore and figure out what's up with that survey data, you may want to expose a lot of those parameters to them as well. If instead we've got our answer, we know what we want to say, we may want to pull out on some of the interactivity and focus a little more on just that static question, so just have the results up. Usually we're somewhere in between where we want to allow someone to drill into the data, but we have a general message. And we use this idea of guided analytics where we start with the most summary information and work our way down. So if you have that demographic data, those things that you want to split things out on, then it can be a really good idea to start with those as drill downs with small visualizations that add the information, and then that will continue to filter down into the further detail of your dashboard. In my case, I wanted people to see how they stacked up against others on the survey. So for me, having that parameter where I could calculate where I'm at became more important. So in the dashboard that I made off of this data, what we end up with is actually fairly simple, because the 2 things that I really locked on to were how differently people related themselves on these different questions. And this is a slightly different resolution, so I've got a, each of the individual people and how they rank themselves, so or women or men, is available as a filter on this dashboard. So I have one tiny visualization telling me how many surveys overall. If someone selects a different choice on the nerdiness level that they feel they have, the circles are going to recalculate and show where they are with the overall average on the background and the overall average on the left. You can change the characteristics that you're viewing, again, just with a simple group that allows you to pick which one, so I can fit as many as possible onto the page. And then beneath that, because it fascinated me that the more nerdy someone ranked themselves, the more likely they were to lie about knowing a word. Because if you're at 7, you're more likely to lie than anyone else. So that piece stood out for me as well. So if you ever do want to take this survey, and this is up on Tableau Public if you're interested in pulling it down. I don't have any internet, so I'm not going to be able to show you the link. But these surveys are all available online, and you can actually still go and take this survey. So at this point, I think we have about 5 minutes left. So again, surveys, huge topic, intimidating to open it up for questions, but we will do that. And in the meantime, I'm going to encourage you to take the survey for this class, as well as recommend a couple of other sections that you may want to take. So survey is on your app, and if you're interested in some of these calculation types, those are some great sessions to cover the similar prep information or calculation needs. Any questions?
I know you talked mostly about numbers, but does Tableau have any functionality for like comments?
Yes, great question. I left that out intentionally because it's a huge topic. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. The question was, does Tableau have anything specifically for dealing with text? Yes. In this data, there was one text field, and it was just entering your major. So are you looking at just displaying them or doing analysis on them?
I would like to do analysis.
Like to do analysis on them?
Comments, like so longer.
Okay, yeah. Sentiment analysis, essentially, kind of going into that piece. I don't have much information on that right here. I haven't played with that as much other than displaying the content, but sentiment analysis is something you can look into. There is another speaker here who has talked quite a bit about that in relation to sets.
Yes.
So you may want to look into that relationship to work on the text side.
There is some you can do with R, and using the R plugin, you can bring in that sentiment analysis that you do in R and bring that into Tableau to do your visualization.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
no problem. Yes, sir.
Okay, so when you were showing frequency distributions for questions plus the mean response, I assume you can do like males and females separately.
Yes.
But is it possible to show these, which of those two mean comparisons are statistically significant?
Statistical, well, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. Yes, you can. You can do that. There are calculations in Tableau that will talk about your variance and the words are failing me right now. They'll talk about your variance and your standard deviation, and you can bring those out. There is a neat little trick on Tableau where if you have a bunch of data and you want to do some statistics about it, and let's just do something like, let's bring that out. Let's take that away. And let's take the right click and do the count distinct of row ID. You can, using the worksheet cards, show the summary, and that gives you a whole bunch of statistics about it. And that does the statistics automatically. You can do whichever statistics you want, and if you want more than that, you can start getting into the calculations and the calculated fields, and Tableau does have a whole host of calculations that will automatically check for statistical significance.
I'm talking about significant differences between two different groups, like a t-test.
Like a t-test, you can actually do those calculations. You can do those calculations to figure out a t-test, yes. I've done it. I do, and if I had the internet up, I would show you my t-test calculator, but yes, you can do that.
Cool.
Yes.
This is great, like way more information than I can process right now, but I was wondering, you talked about the couple blogs, but then this presentation, I wasn't sure what part of that is available or...
So So all of these will be made available. The presentations are recorded, and someone who might know more than me, correct me if I'm wrong, but these all are going to be recorded, and you'll have access to them from the Tableau website.
Yes, and these materials.
And I'm being told we are out of time. Thank you all very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your convention.